You're fired. You just violated compliance policy.
If I had to do it again, I would still serve them.
She was fired for helping a veteran's dog. What happened next changed everything. Sometimes courage means choosing compassion over career security, and the most powerful changes come from within communities that refuse to accept injustice. The Mason Mug Cafe sat like a warm beacon on Main Street in Mason, Georgia. Its hand-painted sign and checkered curtains creating an atmosphere of small-town comfort just 15 minutes from Fort Granger Marine Base. Inside, the morning crowd gathered around mismatched tables, their conversations mixing with the gentle hiss of the espresso machine and the rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee. Grace Donnelly moved through the cafe with practiced efficiency, her 35 years having taught her that genuine hospitality meant remembering not just orders, but stories. She knew which Marines were deployed, which families had children overseas, and which veterans needed extra patience on difficult days. Her auburn hair was pulled back practically, and her apron bore coffee stains that marked someone who prioritized service over appearance. At corner table 12 sat Ray Martinez, a Marine veteran whose trembling hands told the story of difficult transitions. Beside his chair lay Shadow, a black German shepherd wearing a service dog vest, whose calm presence allowed Ray to function in public spaces. Shadow's training helped Ray manage anxiety that had made civilian life challenging until he'd found this refuge. Grace had watched Ray's transformation over 18 months of regular visits. Initially, he'd barely whispered his order and avoided eye contact. Now, he managed conversations with other veterans and could sit through the morning rush without obvious distress, all because Shadow provided the support Ray needed to reclaim his independence. The morning routine proceeded normally until Logan Prescott entered at 9:47 a.m. The state health inspector's crisp navy blazer and clipboard immediately shifted the cafe's relaxed atmosphere. His reputation for rigid enforcement had already created problems for 3 local businesses this month. Grace greeted him professionally, unaware that her response to what happened next would define not just her career, but her community's values forever. Logan Prescott moved through the Mason Mug with mechanical precision, viewing restaurants as potential violations rather than community gathering places. At 42, he'd built his career on enforcing regulations without consideration for context, believing that compassion compromised professional standards. "Unannounced inspection," Prescott announced curtly, producing documentation that gave him authority to examine every aspect of the cafe's operations. Grace nodded politely, having dealt with inspectors before, though none quite as inflexible as Prescott's reputation suggested. The inspection proceeded routinely until Prescott noticed Shadow lying quietly beside Ray's chair. The service dog remained perfectly still, his behavior exemplifying the training that qualified him as medical equipment. But Prescott's reaction was immediate and hostile. "That animal violates state health code," Prescott declared loudly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cafe. "No animals permitted where food is served. Either it leaves immediately, or this establishment faces closure." Ray's hand began trembling as he gripped his coffee cup, the confrontation triggering responses that Shadow was trained to manage. The service dog remained alert but calm, sensing his handler's distress while maintaining professional demeanor. Grace stepped forward, her voice remaining steady despite growing tension. Sir, Shadow is a registered service dog. Federal ADA law specifically permits service animals in all public accommodations. Prescott's face flushed with anger at having his authority questioned. I don't care what vest that animal wears. Dogs carry contaminants that threaten food safety. Remove it now, or I close this place. The confrontation drew attention from other customers, including several off-duty military personnel who recognized both the injustice and Ray's distress. Grace realized she faced a choice that would define her fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Regional Manager Deborah Lyle chose that moment to arrive for a routine check-in, witnessing the confrontation from the doorway. Her corporate mindset prioritized avoiding regulatory conflicts over supporting employee decisions, regardless of legal or moral considerations. Grace looked at Ray, whose anxiety was escalating despite Shadow's presence, then at other veterans watching to see whether their community would protect or abandon them to bureaucratic indifference. I won't ask a veteran to leave because he needs medical support, Grace said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the cafe. Shadow is Ray's medical equipment, and demanding their removal violates federal disability law. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful stands come not from external rescue, but from communities that refuse to accept injustice. Grace's declaration hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before the entire community. Prescott's face flushed deeper as his authority was directly questioned in front of witnesses, while Lyle stepped forward with corporate authority designed to end employee insubordination immediately. Grace Donnelly, Lyle announced coldly, you've just violated direct compliance policy in front of a state inspector. Pack your things. You're terminated. The cafe erupted in shocked gasps. A spoon clattered to the floor as someone's grip went slack. Ray started to rise, apparently planning to leave rather than watch Grace lose her job defending him, but other customers gestured for him to stay seated. I understand, Grace said quietly, untying her apron with hands that trembled only slightly. But I'd make the same choice again. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly regular who'd been coming to the cafe for 3 years, stood up slowly from her corner booth. Excuse me, she said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd lived through decades of right and wrong. Did you just fire this young lady for protecting a veteran's legal rights? This is a business decision, Lyle replied defensively. We can't risk regulatory violations. Service animals aren't violations, called out Tom Rodriguez, an off-duty Marine who'd been having coffee with his wife. They're protected under federal law. I should know. I helped train military working dogs for 8 years. Grace felt something shift in the cafe's atmosphere. Instead of the isolated stand she'd expected to make, she was witnessing her community choose sides in real time. Customers who'd been quietly enjoying their morning coffee were transforming into advocates for both her decision and Ray's rights. Sarah Chen, a local attorney who'd been working on her laptop in the back corner, closed her computer and approached the confrontation. Mr. Prescott, I'm curious about your understanding of federal disability law as it supersedes state health regulations. Prescott found himself facing not just employee insubordination, but legal challenge from someone qualified to understand the jurisdictional issues he'd apparently ignored. Health codes protect public safety, he insisted, though his earlier confidence was wavering. ADA compliance protects civil rights, Sarah replied firmly. Federal law explicitly permits service animals in food service establishments. Denying access constitutes illegal discrimination. Grace watched in amazement as her simple moral stand was being supported by people she'd served coffee to for years, but had never expected to fight legal battles alongside. The community she'd helped create through genuine hospitality was now defending the values they'd built together. Ray spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice stronger than Grace had heard in months. Grace didn't know I served in Afghanistan or that Shadow helps me with PTSD. She stood up for me because she saw someone being treated unfairly. That means more than any medal. The statement struck everyone present with its simple truth. Grace's courage hadn't been motivated by Ray's military service, but by basic human decency and recognition that everyone deserved dignity regardless of circumstances. Young Marine Corporal James Walsh, barely 22 and still in civilian clothes from his off-duty status, pulled out his phone. "Ma'am," he said to Grace, "would you mind if I recorded you explaining why you made this choice? I think people need to hear this." Grace looked around the cafe at faces that had become family customers who'd trusted her with their stories, their celebrations, their quiet struggles. The community support was overwhelming, but she realized her fight was just beginning. What she didn't know was that sometimes the most powerful changes come from ordinary people refusing to accept injustice rather than waiting for external rescue. Grace took a deep breath, knowing that whatever she said next would define not just her own stand, but potentially inspire others facing similar choices. James Walsh held his phone steady, while the entire cafe fell silent in anticipation. 6 years ago, I started working here because I believed cafes should be places where everyone feels welcome. Grace began, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've served coffee to Marines heading overseas, to their families worried about deployments, and to veterans trying to rebuild their lives in civilian communities. She looked directly at Ray, whose anxiety had visibly decreased as he witnessed community support rather than the isolation he'd expected. Ray has been coming here for 18 months. I've watched him go from barely able to order coffee to joining conversations with other veterans. Shadow isn't just his service dog. Shadow is his bridge back to living life. Prescott interrupted with bureaucratic authority that was beginning to sound hollow. Regulations exist for everyone's protection. Whose protection? Grace challenged, her voice carrying new authority. Ray's protection comes from Shadow. His medical necessity doesn't threaten anyone's health or safety. Demanding he abandon his medical support violates everything we claim to believe about supporting our veterans. The crowd murmured agreement, with several people nodding emphatically. Mrs. Peterson spoke up again. This young lady has served this community with grace and kindness for years. If standing up for what's right costs her job, then we need to question what kind of community we are. Lyle realized the situation was spiraling beyond her corporate training as more customers voiced support for Grace. The regional manager faced something she'd never encountered: unified community opposition to what she'd assumed would be a simple personnel decision. Sarah Chen stepped forward with legal authority. Ms. Lyle, I'm prepared to represent Grace pro bono if she faces any legal consequences for defending federal disability rights. Mr. Prescott, I strongly suggest you review ADA regulations before taking any enforcement actions. James Walsh stopped recording and looked at his phone with surprise. "Ma'am, this has already been shared 50 times, and people are asking how they can support you." Grace felt overwhelmed by the unexpected scope of community response, but also empowered by the realization that her stand had inspired others to speak up for values they'd previously taken for granted. Tom Rodriguez made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I'm organizing an immediate boycott of any establishment that doesn't respect veteran service animals. Grace deserves better than being fired for doing what's right." The threat of economic consequences finally penetrated Lyle's corporate calculations. A boycott supported by the military community could devastate the cafe chain's local operations, particularly given their proximity to Fort Granger. Prescott faced the reality that his enforcement action had triggered community resistance with legal backing and economic implications. His rigid interpretation of health codes was colliding with federal civil rights law and public opinion simultaneously. Grace realized that her simple moral choice had become something much larger, a defining moment for her community's character and values. The question was no longer whether she'd keep her job, but whether Mason, Georgia, would choose justice over bureaucratic convenience. The answer was emerging from voices throughout the cafe, unified in support of both Grace's courage and Ray's rights. The unified community support created pressure that corporate bureaucracy couldn't withstand. Lyle found herself facing not just employee insubordination, but potential legal action, economic boycotts, and viral social media coverage that could damage the company's reputation nationwide. Grace watched as her simple stand for Ray's rights transformed into something larger, a community defining its values in real time. The customers she'd served for years were revealing themselves as allies she'd never known she had. Sarah Chen addressed Lyle directly. "Ms. Lyle, firing Grace for complying with federal disability law exposes your company to significant legal liability. I'm prepared to file discrimination charges on both Grace's and Ray's behalf." The legal threat, combined with growing social media attention, created a crisis that exceeded Lyle's authority to resolve. She pulled out her phone to call corporate headquarters, stepping aside for a conversation that everyone understood would determine the immediate outcome. Meanwhile, Tom Rodriguez was coordinating with other off-duty Marines who'd been alerted to the situation. But instead of dramatic military intervention, they were organizing practical community support, legal funds, media outreach, and economic pressure through coordinated boycotts. "Grace," Mrs. Peterson announced, "the community center has offered you space to start your own coffee service if needed. We won't let this stand go unrewarded." The offer revealed something Grace hadn't anticipated. Her years of genuine service had created loyalty that transcended employment relationships. The community was prepared to support her independence rather than simply protest her treatment. James Walsh continued documenting the scene, but now he was capturing community organization rather than individual confrontation. "Ma'am, veterans groups across 3 states are sharing your story. People want to know how they can support businesses that actually respect service animals." Ray stood up slowly, his movement drawing attention from the entire cafe. Shadow remained alert beside him, both dog and handler displaying calm confidence that hadn't been present an hour earlier. "Grace," Ray said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, You gave me back my dignity today. But more than that, you showed everyone here what courage looks like when it matters most." Lyle returned from her phone call with an expression that mixed relief and corporate embarrassment. "Grace, I've spoken with regional headquarters. There's been a reconsideration of your termination." "What kind of reconsideration?" Sarah Chen asked sharply. "Full reinstatement with back pay, plus a formal apology for the misunderstanding about federal disability compliance," Lyle replied, clearly reading from notes she'd taken during her call. Grace felt vindicated, but also transformed by the experience. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but I want to make sure this doesn't happen to other employees who stand up for customers' rights." "Company-wide training on ADA compliance will be implemented immediately," Lyle confirmed, still referring to her notes. "And new policies protecting employees who advocate for disability accommodation." Prescott found himself isolated as even his regulatory authority couldn't overcome unified community opposition backed by federal law. He completed his inspection without further incident, apparently deciding that discretion was preferable to continued confrontation. The immediate crisis resolved, but its impact extended far beyond Mason Mug Cafe. Grace's stand had demonstrated that ordinary people could successfully challenge institutional indifference when they were willing to risk personal consequences for moral principles. As the cafe gradually returned to normal operations, Grace realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in her own confidence, but in her community's understanding of its power to protect vulnerable members and support those who stood up for justice. Sometimes, courage means choosing compassion over career security. And the most powerful changes come from within communities that refuse to accept injustice, proving that authentic heroism emerges from moral choice rather than external rescue. Grace's story spread through military communities and veterans organizations, inspiring similar stands by service workers who'd previously felt powerless to challenge discriminatory policies. Her example demonstrated that ordinary employees could successfully advocate for customers' rights when supported by community action. The cafe chain implemented comprehensive ADA training and established policies protecting employees who defend disability accommodation, using Grace's case as a model for balancing regulatory compliance with civil rights protection. Her story became required viewing during corporate sensitivity training sessions. Ray became an advocate for service dog awareness, his confidence restored by experiencing community support rather than isolation. He regularly spoke at veterans events about the importance of civilian allies in military transition processes. Sarah Chen organized a local legal clinic providing free consultation for disability discrimination cases, inspired by the community response to Grace's stand. The clinic became a model for similar programs in other military communities. Mason, Georgia, earned recognition as a veteran-friendly community, attracting businesses and residents who valued the inclusive atmosphere Grace had helped create through her moral courage and community support. Sometimes, courage means choosing compassion over career security, and the most powerful changes come from within communities that refuse to accept injustice, demonstrating that collective action can triumph over institutional indifference when individuals choose principle over convenience.